I smiled because I had no other choice. If I'd looked away for even a second, my husband would have noticed the panic in my face. Instead, I stood in our driveway holding a paper grocery bag against my chest, while the two men shook hands just a few feet in front of me. "Thanks again," my husband said with an easy grin. "You really saved us today." The other man smiled back. "Happy to help." His voice was calm, almost too calm, like we hadn't spent the previous evening standing inches apart in a place where my husband believed I had never been. Like he hadn't looked at me before getting into his car and quietly said, "I hope we never meet again." I had hoped for exactly the same thing. Instead, there they were, laughing, talking, acting as if fate hadn't just tied the tightest knot around my throat. My husband turned toward me. "Honey, this is Ethan. His truck broke down near the shopping center yesterday, but he still stopped to help me change the tire this morning." Yesterday. The word landed inside me like a stone. Yesterday. That was supposed to belong to me alone. A forgotten afternoon. A secret that existed only between two strangers. I forced another smile. "It's nice to meet you." Our eyes met for barely a heartbeat. No surprise. No recognition. Nothing that another person would notice. But I saw the tiny pause before he answered. "You too." He knew. I knew. And now we both knew something even worse. Neither of us could leave. My husband was already inviting him inside. "You've got time for coffee, right?" "I don't want to intrude." "It's no intrusion." My husband laughed and slapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Anyone who helps me on the side of the road deserves at least one decent cup of coffee." My fingers tightened around the grocery bag. One apple slipped free, bounced onto the driveway and rolled toward Ethan's shoes. He bent to pick it up. So did I. For one suspended second our hands almost touched. He stopped first. "You dropped this." His voice stayed perfectly steady. Mine almost disappeared. "Thank you." Our fingertips brushed for less than a moment as I took the apple. Warm skin. Cold fear. That single touch felt louder than any confession. My husband noticed nothing. He was already unlocking the front door. As we walked inside, I stayed a step behind them. I watched my husband talking with effortless trust, asking Ethan where he worked, joking about broken cars, laughing at stories that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. The sound of their voices filled the house. Mine stayed trapped somewhere behind my ribs, because every question my husband asked brought Ethan one step deeper into our lives. And every honest answer carried the risk of reaching the one place neither of us could afford. The truth wasn't sitting at my kitchen table. Not yet. But for the first time, it had been invited in. I stood at the kitchen counter with my back to them, waiting for the coffee maker to finish its slow, familiar rhythm. Behind me, my husband and Ethan had already settled into easy conversation. It happened so naturally that it made my stomach tighten. "So what do you do?" my husband asked. "I restore old houses," Ethan replied. "Mostly woodwork. Doors, staircases, windows. The kind of jobs that take patience." "That explains why you knew exactly what to do with my tire." Ethan laughed. "I've learned that most problems aren't as complicated as they look." I almost dropped the coffee mugs. If only that were true. Steam curled into the air as I poured the coffee, careful to keep my hands steady. My reflection shimmered in the dark surface for a second. I barely recognized the woman staring back. Yesterday, I had convinced myself everything was over. It hadn't even begun. My husband wandered into the kitchen. "Need help?" "I'm fine." "You sure? You look tired." "I didn't sleep much." He smiled without suspicion. "Neither did I. That tire kept me outside half the morning." If only that had been the reason I couldn't sleep. I carried the mugs to the table. When I placed Ethan's cup in front of him, he thanked me with the same calm expression he'd worn since arriving. Only his fingers betrayed him. He wrapped them tightly around the mug before taking a sip, as if he needed something solid to hold. My husband leaned back in his chair. "So, how long have you lived around here?" "About 6 months." "No kidding? We probably crossed paths a dozen times." Ethan nodded politely. "Probably." I looked down at the table. We hadn't crossed paths a dozen times. Just once. One impossible afternoon that wasn't supposed to matter. It had started because of rain. Heavy summer rain that arrived without warning. I had ducked into a small neighborhood bookstore to wait for it to pass. The place was nearly empty. Only one employee was shelving books in the back. And one customer stood near the window watching the storm. Ethan. He had glanced at me only once before stepping aside. "You can have the dry spot." I laughed. So generous. I don't like watching people get soaked. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the power went out. The lights disappeared. Rain hammered against the windows, and the room fell strangely quiet. Someone behind the counter sighed. "Looks like we're stuck for a while." Neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave. We talked. First about books. Then about travel. Then about nothing important at all. There wasn't any flirting. No promises. No plans. Just the strange comfort of speaking to someone who looked at me as if every answer actually mattered. When the lights finally returned, nearly an hour had passed. Outside, the rain had softened into a drizzle. He held the door open. "I guess this is where strangers go back to being strangers." I remember smiling. "I guess so." I should have walked away. Instead, I turned back. "So, what's your name?" "Ethan." "I'm Claire." He repeated my name quietly, almost like he was making sure he wouldn't forget it. Neither of us asked for a phone number. Neither of us crossed any obvious line. But as I drove home, I realized I hadn't thought about my husband once during that entire hour. That frightened me more than anything. Now Ethan sat across from my husband, smiling politely as they joked about old houses and broken cars. Neither of them knew that the real crack in this house hadn't appeared today. It had started yesterday, the moment I decided to learn a stranger's name. I spent the rest of that afternoon pretending everything was normal. After Ethan finally stood to leave, my husband walked him to the front door. "You've got my number now," he said. "If you ever need anything, just call." Ethan smiled politely. "I appreciate that." Then he looked at me. Only for a second. "Take care, Claire." "You too." The front door closed. I waited until I heard his truck disappear down the street, before I let out the breath I'd been holding for what felt like hours. My husband stretched his arms above his head. "Good guy." I forced a smile. "He seems nice." You know, it's funny. You meet hundreds of people in life, but every once in a while someone just feels genuine. The word stayed with me. Genuine. That was exactly what had made Ethan dangerous. Not because he had chased me. Not because he had crossed a line. Because he hadn't. That quiet hour in the bookstore kept replaying in my head for reasons I couldn't explain. He had listened. Really listened. When I mentioned that I used to paint, he asked what I liked creating. When I admitted I hadn't touched a canvas in years, he didn't tell me I should start again. He simply asked, "Do you miss it?" No one had asked me that in a very long time. Not even my husband. Life with Daniel wasn't unhappy. It was predictable. We paid bills together. Cooked dinner together. Watched the same shows every Friday night. He kissed my forehead before leaving for work. I kissed his cheek before turning off the bedroom light. Nothing was broken. But somewhere along the way we had stopped asking each other the questions that mattered. That realization frightened me more than meeting Ethan ever had. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Daniel was still asleep beside me, one arm stretched across the bed. I slipped quietly into the kitchen, hoping coffee would settle the restlessness inside me. Instead, my phone lit up. An unknown number. My pulse jumped. There was only one message. "I wasn't going to contact you." Then I realized I'd regret staying silent. I stared at the screen without breathing. A second message appeared. "Yesterday reminded me how rare it is to meet someone you genuinely connect with. If I'm mistaken, ignore this. I'll never bother you again." No flirting. No pressure. Just honesty. That somehow made it harder. I locked the phone and placed it face down on the counter. Daniel walked into the kitchen a minute later, rubbing his eyes. "Morning." He wrapped an arm around my waist and kissed my temple. "You've been up long?" "Not really." He poured himself coffee, completely unaware that my heartbeat had become louder than the quiet house around us. Then he smiled. "Oh, I almost forgot." "What?" "Ethan invited us to a neighborhood barbecue this Saturday." The coffee cup nearly slipped from my hand. He Invited us? Yeah. Said a few neighbors get together every summer. Thought it'd be a good chance for us to meet everyone. I looked down at my untouched phone. I hadn't answered his message. I hadn't decided what I wanted. But somehow, the next chapter had already invited itself into my life. I should have said no the moment Daniel mentioned the barbecue. Instead, I heard myself ask the one question I never should have asked. What time does it start? Daniel smiled. I knew you'd come around. I never said yes. You didn't have to. He kissed my forehead, grabbed his keys and headed for work. I'll be home early. We can go together. The front door closed. Silence settled over the house. I stared at my phone for nearly 5 minutes before unlocking it again. Ethan's messages were still there. Simple, respectful, patient. My thumb hovered over the screen. I typed 3 different replies. Deleted all of them. Finally, I wrote only one sentence. I think it's better if we don't talk anymore. I read it twice before pressing send. The typing indicator appeared almost immediately, then disappeared. A few seconds later, his reply arrived. You're probably right. I hope life is kind to you, Claire. That should have been the end. I wanted it to be. I slipped the phone into a drawer and spent the rest of the week trying to convince myself I'd done the right thing. By Saturday afternoon, I almost believed it. The neighborhood park buzzed with conversation. Children chased each other through the grass. Music drifted from portable speakers. Someone stood behind a grill, laughing as smoke curled into the warm evening air. Daniel waved at people as though he'd lived there for years. Ethan. I froze before I even saw him. He turned from the grill with the same calm expression I'd been trying to forget. Glad you made it. Daniel walked over and shook his hand again. You really pulled this together. It wasn't just me. Ethan nodded toward a few neighbors arranging tables. Everyone helped. His eyes reached mine for only a heartbeat. No smile. No hidden message. Just careful distance. Exactly what I'd asked for. It should have brought relief. Instead, it left an ache I hadn't expected. The afternoon passed slowly. Daniel and Ethan talked about home repairs. About baseball. About old trucks. I floated from one conversation to another, pretending to listen while never losing track of where Ethan was. We barely exchanged a word. Once, while reaching for a bottle of water from the same cooler, our hands paused inches apart. You first, he said quietly. No. It's fine. He stepped back without another word. That tiny moment somehow hurt more than the hour we'd spent together in the bookstore. Because now we were strangers on purpose. As the sun began to set, people gathered around long picnic tables for dinner. I found an empty seat beside Daniel. Across from us, Ethan sat talking with an older couple. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Then Daniel raised his glass. I have to say something. The conversations around us softened. He smiled across the table. I've lived in plenty of places, but I've never felt welcome this quickly. Several neighbors laughed. Daniel looked directly at Ethan. And that's mostly because of you. People nodded in agreement. Someone clapped. Then Daniel said the words that made my chest tighten. You know what, Ethan? Next weekend you should come over for dinner. The table grew quiet for a fraction of a second. Ethan looked at me. Not with hope. Not with fear. Just one silent question. I couldn't answer it. Daniel noticed nothing. He was already smiling, waiting for Ethan's response. And for the first time, I realized this secret wasn't threatening to destroy my marriage because of what had happened. It was threatening to destroy it because of what hadn't. I'd love to. Ethan's answer came after the smallest pause. Just long enough for me to notice. Too short for anyone else. Daniel smiled. Perfect. Next Friday. Around us, conversations picked up again. Plates moved across the table. Someone started telling a story that made everyone laugh. I couldn't hear any of it. All I could think was that, in less than a week, the one man I had been trying to avoid would be sitting inside my home. Friday arrived faster than I wanted. Daniel spent the afternoon cleaning the patio. I want everything to look nice, he said. You'd think the mayor was coming. He laughed. I just like returning favors. Returning favors. If only he knew how much I wished there were no favors left to return. I kept myself busy in the kitchen, chopping vegetables that didn't need chopping and stirring a sauce that had been finished 10 minutes earlier. My hands needed something to do, otherwise my mind would wander. At exactly 6:30, the doorbell rang. Daniel wiped his hands on a towel. "I'll get it." I stayed where I was. Through the opening between the kitchen and the hallway, I watched Daniel pull the front door open. "Ethan." "Right on time." "Hope I'm not early." "Not at all." Ethan stepped inside carrying a small paper bag. "I brought dessert." "You didn't have to. My mother would have been disappointed if I showed up empty-handed." Daniel laughed. "I already like your mother." Their voices drifted into the living room. I closed my eyes for a second before forcing myself to walk out with 3 glasses. Ethan looked different outside the bookstore and away from the neighborhood crowd. Not more attractive. More familiar. That was somehow worse. "Claire," Daniel called. "Look what he brought." I smiled politely. "It looks great." "Thank you." "You're welcome." Nothing more. Nothing less. If someone had walked into the room, they would have seen 3 adults making ordinary conversation. Only Ethan and I knew how carefully every word had been measured. Dinner started easily. Daniel talked enough for all of us. He told stories from work, complained about traffic, asked Ethan about a renovation project across town. The 2 of them slipped into conversation with surprising ease. Every time Daniel laughed, I felt another knot tighten inside me, because he trusted him. Completely. Halfway through dinner, Daniel stood. "I forgot the barbecue sauce in the garage." "I'll grab it," I offered quickly. He shook his head. "I know exactly where it is." The back door closed behind him. For the first time, Ethan and I were alone. The silence felt louder than any conversation. He looked down at his plate before speaking. I almost declined. "I wish you had." "So do I." His honesty caught me off guard. Neither of us moved. Neither of us looked toward the door. "I meant what I wrote," he said quietly. "I'm not here to make your life harder." "I know. I haven't contacted you again." "I know." Another silence. Then he said the one thing I hadn't expected. "I've been wondering something." I looked up despite myself. "That day in the bookstore." He stopped, choosing his words carefully. "Were you as surprised as I was?" Before I could answer, Daniel's footsteps echoed through the hallway. Ethan leaned back in his chair as if the conversation had never happened. Daniel walked in holding the bottle above his head. "Found it." I looked at my husband, then at Ethan. One of them had just asked me the question I couldn't stop thinking about. The other still believed there had never been a question at all. I didn't answer Ethan's question. I couldn't. Daniel returned smiling, completely unaware that the room had changed while he was gone. "There we go," he said, setting the bottle on the table. "Now dinner is officially complete." Ethan gave him an easy smile. "I think everything already tasted great." Daniel laughed. "See? That's why I like this guy." I lowered my eyes to my plate. Every compliment, every shared joke between them felt like another thread tying our lives together. The evening stretched on. Dessert came out. Coffee followed. The conversation drifted from work to travel, then to childhood memories. For the first time all night, I actually relaxed. Maybe this was all it would ever be. A strange coincidence. An uncomfortable memory. Nothing more. Then Daniel disappeared upstairs. "I'll grab that photo album," he called. "You have to see Claire's college haircut." "Oh, please don't," I shouted. "It's too late." His footsteps faded down the hallway. The silence returned. Ethan smiled for the first time that evening. "A college haircut? It was terrible." "I don't believe you." "It was." He looked at me for a long second. "I don't think you're capable of looking terrible." The words weren't flirtatious. They were quiet, matter of fact, which made them far more dangerous. I felt warmth rise into my face. "You shouldn't say things like that." "I know. And yet you did." I figured honesty has already caused enough trouble. Before either of us could say another word, Daniel came back carrying a thick blue album. "You ready to embarrass my wife?" I smiled. This time it almost felt real. An hour later, Ethan stood near the front door pulling on his jacket. Thank you for dinner. Daniel opened the door for him. Next time we're coming to your place. Ethan hesitated. If you want. Absolutely. Then Daniel looked at me. What do you think? I forced another nod. That sounds nice. For a fraction of a second, Ethan closed his eyes, almost as if he wished I had said no. After he left, Daniel locked the front door and started stacking empty plates. I told you he'd fit right in. He seems kind. He is. Daniel smiled to himself. You know what's funny? What? You two actually have a lot in common. The plate slipped in my hands and clinked against the sink. What makes you say that? You both listen more than you talk. I turned on the faucet before answering. Maybe. You both like old bookstores. My hand froze under the running water. Slowly, I looked over my shoulder. What? I found out tonight. Daniel shrugged. He mentioned spending rainy afternoons wandering through bookstores. My heartbeat stumbled. It reminded me of you. I forced myself to keep washing the same perfectly clean plate. That's a funny coincidence, isn't it? He smiled again. I almost asked whether you'd ever been to the same one. I couldn't speak. Daniel walked closer, drying his hands with a towel. Then he tilted his head. Claire. Yeah. Can I ask you something? My throat tightened. Of course. He studied my face for several quiet seconds. Not accusing. Not suspicious. Just curious. Why do you always look nervous when Ethan's around? For the first time since all of this began, my husband wasn't looking at Ethan. He was looking at me. My heart pounded so hard I was certain Daniel could hear it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't suspicious. He was simply waiting. Claire. I forced a small laugh. I'm not nervous. You are. He leaned against the kitchen counter, folding the dish towel in slow, careful motions. I've known you for 12 years. I looked away. When you're uncomfortable, you tuck your hands into your sleeves. Without thinking, I glanced down. My fingers had already disappeared inside the cuffs of my sweater. I pulled them out immediately. Daniel smiled gently. See, I've just been tired. That's not it. His voice stayed calm. You've been somewhere else ever since the day he came over. The room felt smaller. I searched for an answer that wouldn't sound rehearsed. I guess. He's still a stranger. Daniel nodded slowly. That's fair. For one hopeful second, I thought the conversation was over. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. You know what I envy about him? I frowned. What? He pays attention. I blinked. Daniel laughed softly. Not to you. He shook his head. To everyone. He remembers little things. People's names. Stories they tell once. I wish I were more like that. I didn't know what to say. Because the thing Daniel admired was the very reason Ethan had become impossible to forget. The next week, life settled into something that almost felt normal. Almost. Daniel exchanged messages with Ethan about borrowing a ladder. They joked about helping a neighbor repair a fence. Every time Ethan's name appeared on Daniel's phone, I felt the same quiet knot tighten inside me. Ethan never contacted me. Not once. He kept his promise. That should have made everything easier. Instead, it left too much room for my imagination. One Thursday evening, Daniel walked into the living room holding his phone. Bad timing. What happened? Ethan twisted his ankle at work. Is he okay? The question escaped before I could stop it. Daniel looked at me for a second. I think so. He said he'll be fine in a few days. I nodded too quickly. That's good. Daniel smiled. Would you mind coming with me tomorrow? I thought we'd drop off some soup. Every muscle in my body went still. You want to visit him? Why not? He doesn't have family nearby. Daniel shrugged. It's what neighbors do. I opened my mouth to refuse. No words came. The following evening, we stood outside Ethan's small house. Daniel balanced a container of homemade soup in one hand. You grabbed the bread? I've got it. The porch light flicked on before we reached the steps. The front door opened. Ethan stood there wearing a gray sweater and a walking boot. His surprise lasted less than a second. Then he smiled. You really didn't have to do this. Daniel handed him the soup. That's what friends are for. Friends. The word lingered between us. Ethan stepped aside. Come in. His house was quiet, warm. A record player spun softly in the corner. Books filled nearly every wall. Daniel looked around with admiration. I like this place. Thanks. I wandered only a few steps into the living room before stopping. On a shelf near the window sat a small ceramic lighthouse. My breath caught. I knew that lighthouse. During the storm in the bookstore, I'd picked it up from a display table and joked that it looked too lonely to be sold by itself. Ethan had laughed. It just hasn't found the right shelf yet. I had forgotten those words. He hadn't. Daniel walked over and lifted the little lighthouse. That's a nice piece. Ethan looked at me. Only for a heartbeat. Then he answered quietly. It reminds me of someone I met once. Daniel smiled without thinking anything of it. I felt the color leave my face. For the first time, I realized the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in words. They're hidden in the little things only two people remember. I couldn't stop looking at the little ceramic lighthouse. Daniel placed it back on the shelf without a second thought. It's got character, he said. Ethan gave a small nod. I've always liked things that carry a memory. I looked away before either of them could read my face. We stayed less than an hour. Daniel insisted Ethan call if he needed anything. Ethan thanked him again. As we stepped outside, the evening air felt cooler than before. Daniel slipped his hand into mine. You've been quiet. I'm just tired. He squeezed my fingers gently. I've been thinking. My chest tightened. About what? I don't think I've thanked you enough. I stared at him. For what? For always being here. He smiled as we walked toward the car. I know life with me isn't exactly exciting. I stopped. What do you mean? He laughed softly. I know I'm predictable. He looked up at the stars for a moment. I get caught up in work. I forget to ask about your day. I assume you'll always be beside me. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. I've been trying to do better. He opened the passenger door for me. I just hope I'm not too late. I barely slept that night. Every memory replayed in a different order. The bookstore. The rain. The coffee. The barbecue. The dinner. The lighthouse. Nothing dramatic had happened. No affair. No stolen nights. No promises whispered in the dark. Just 1,000 tiny moments that had quietly changed the direction of my heart. That was the truth I had been hiding. And suddenly I realized something. If Daniel ever discovered it from someone else, he would never believe how little had actually happened. The next morning he found me sitting alone on the back porch. A cup of coffee had gone cold in my hands. He sat beside me without speaking. The silence between us felt familiar. Too familiar. I need to tell you something, I whispered. He turned toward me. What is it? I met Ethan before you did. His expression didn't change. I know. I blinked. What? He looked down at his coffee. I figured it out after the bookstore comment. My heartbeat stopped. I asked him. The world seemed to freeze. What? Did he say? Daniel smiled sadly. He told me the truth. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. He said you met once because of a storm. I couldn't speak. He said you talked for an hour. I nodded. He told me you tried to end all contact. Another silent nod. Daniel looked at me for a long time. He also told me something else. What? He said the only person he felt sorry for was me. The tears finally spilled over. I'm sorry. I know. I never wanted to hurt you. I know. His voice never rose. He never looked angry. That somehow hurt even more. After a long silence, he reached for my hand. I don't think you fell in love with another man. I closed my eyes. I think you remembered what it feels like to be truly seen. A tear rolled down my cheek. He gently wiped it away. And that's the part one should have noticed long before anyone else did. Neither of us spoke again for several minutes. The morning sun climbed slowly over the trees. For the first time in weeks, There were no secrets left between us. Only two people, quietly deciding whether honesty could become the beginning of something stronger than silence. Sometimes a marriage isn't broken by the person who walks in. Sometimes it's saved by the truth that finally walks out.